It's not the big things. It's something maybe you have shelved that you're not giving the weight to, that you realize, wow, this thing really, really affected me. And I've been carrying this one thing my whole life. And I've created this monster out of what is practically a normal, everyday human being.
That was Colin Broderick, writer and movie maker. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to another Global Irish Conversation here on Irish Stew. Today's episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ogham Art, where you can find original prints, jewelry, home decor, and custom gifts featuring Ogham, the first written form of the Irish language. Visit oghamart.com, and that's OGHAMART.com, and listeners can save 20% at oghamart.com using coupon code IRISHSTEW. That's OGHAMART.com.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Irish Stew. I'm joined by my partner in crime, John Lee. I am Martin Nutty. And John, who have we got coming up on this episode?
Martin, we've got a guest that's going to really fit into our Global Irish Nation theme with stops in County Tyrone, London, and New York with an artist. I'll say an artist who has produced a tremendous variety of experiences for the audience as a writer, as a poet, as an editor, short story writer, memoirist, playwright, and movie scriptwriter and movie actor, Colin Broderick. Welcome, Colin.
Hey, John, thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you aboard. I'm really looking forward to unraveling this conversation. We are looking at the reprint of your book, The Writing Irish of New York, and we'll compare notes because I'm lucky enough to know a lot of the people on that list.
Likewise, one of the reasons I tackled that project was, I'm a member of the Irish American Writers and Artists Association, which is an incredible organization, really, to bring a community of writers together here, Irish and American. It sort of pulls the whole scenario together here. Not just in New York, I find, but really, all over the US. It's a great organization. They do wonderful things. But I just felt like this book didn't exist. I was actually laying in bed one night about 5 years ago, and I just had the thought, oh my God, this book doesn't exist. Let me do this. And I regretted that so many times. It was a long, arduous process pulling it together, but it was really, I did it out of an act of love and commitment for the community more than anything else.
I just want to let you know, I had a lot of involvement with the Irish American Writers and Artists in the early years. I was on the board for several years and became good friends with Peter Quinn in particular, Mary Pat Kelly, Malik Court, Larry Kerwin. So I have to say the vision of the Irish American Writers and Artists really influenced my approach to this podcast. That sort of exploring an Irish American identity as something distinct from but related to, an Irish identity. There's something different about it. There's something to be celebrated about it on its own. It's not a secondhand version of Irish. It's its own thing.
It's such an important conversation, John. And if you've looked sort of at what I've done over the last 14 years in writing and publishing, whether it's movies or books or whatever, all of it explores this question of what it means to be Irish in America, what it means to be a part of the diaspora, an immigrant. And, I find the Irish situation here in America so fascinating because you have 40 million Americans of Irish descent. And that's 40 million Irish, I consider brothers and sisters, blood brothers and sisters. And they are more excited about their Irish heritage than Irish people in Ireland. And I know that from personal fact because I'm Irish, and it was living in America that ignited my passion for my own identity, my own Irish identity. And for me, I've just come to really embrace what that is. I think that in Ireland, there's not enough of an effort to embrace. There's a sort of like, oh, they're the Yanks and they're different, until they're coming over spending the tourism dollars, of course. But there's not enough of an effort to really embrace the full diaspora and recognize that we're really one nation in a way, one brotherhood of people with this sort of undying love for this tiny little island and what that means to us, which is a bizarre. There's very few cultures in the world that you find that type of love for, the homeland. And it's almost like the rest of the world and other cultures look on sort of in envy because it's such a strong and potent love you see even with our current president. And he's not the first president. Mm-hmm. I would argue that the last time the diaspora were in any way united was when it was John F.K. in the White House, and people were really proud. And you can see that moment now with Biden quoting Haney and talking about how he's connected to Ireland, that there's a real sort of like awakening of, oh, they're us and we're them. And there shouldn't be this division thing that we're different because we have an accent over here is a weird thing for me. And I find I struggle and fight to try and bridge that gap personally every chance I get.
Hey, Colin, you're kind of singing the song that is part of our podcast. And I was just reading your intro to the Writing Irish of New York, and you have a quote in there. You said, "I hated the term Irish American. How dare anyone who did not have an Irish accent say they were Irish?" So there's been an evolution there. But talk to me, hate's a strong word. Talk to me about the anger that seems to sit behind that sentence about how you saw your identity originally and how you see it now.
Well, I can tell you that definitely from a personal point of view, yes, when I first came over, the idea that Irish American guys in the bar would call themselves Irish was almost laughable. And there was a lot of anger towards, I remember when I first came over, there were riots on Bainbridge Avenue. This is back in like the mid to late 80s between Irish guys and Irish American guys. And I mean real full-on riots, guys with sticks and breaking windows. And I was part of that. I was down there at that time, involved in a few very heavy scuffles. And at that time, there was a lot of, at that time, it almost felt more like, the Irish guys had come over and they were suddenly like dating the Irish American girls. And the Irish American guys were very angry about this sort of like, these guys are outsiders basically coming over here and pretending like this is their home. Mm. And we come over and actually did feel like this was our home and we had a right to it. And, looking back on it, as I evolved and got a little bit older and a little wiser, I recognized, what a hurtful thing. But maybe we were all evolving together at some point, coming to this new place. And maybe there's a brighter future for that sort of, for these divisions to sort of fade away. But over time, I started recognizing, through the years, I would get to know Irish American guys and realize, oh my God, I'm talking to their father, and their father is an Irish guy, right. And they have grown up in an Irish home in America with Kerrygold butter and Iwadi and Irish stew and watching Irish and hearing their father curse and learning how to be a carpenter. And they're no less Irish than I am, nor are their children. The second generation, the third generation, it's such a strong culture that it keeps seeping and permeating the next generation. And because of the love of the old country, people cling to it and they hold on to it as a sense of identity, like, this is who I am and I'm proud of it. So it gives people a sense of who they are, where they come from, and a community that they belong to. And, now as a father, you're talking about the evolution, now as the father of three young children who have American accents. My children are Irish American, and I'm proud that they're Irish American. And I constantly I give them me waddy with their dinner at night. And I have that sort of, we have those, I bring them back to Ireland every chance I get. And I try to make sure that they know who they are and to be proud of it.
Yeah, I haven't heard my waddy in a long time since I've been in America. Probably, I think 5 years longer than you. I came here in 1983. So for listeners that are perplexed by my waddy, it is, as you say in America, an Irish soda of dubious orange origin. There we go.
Very good. It's a tongue twister. I buy it a case at a time, so you know.
Martin, they could be a potential sponsor, so, move gently.
Yeah.
That's a sponsor.
We live in hope.
Yeah.
There you go.
Now, I kind of really like origin stories, and I note that you were born in Birmingham, but a couple of months after you were born, your family up sticks and moved to Tyrone. Mm-hmm. And that would have been in 1968. Mm-hmm. The timing looks a little bit questionable. For anybody that's a student of history, the Troubles explodes in 1969. So talk to me about your parents' decision to move back to Tyrone and stay in the face of this kind of, exploding madness.
That's such an interesting question and such an interesting time. For me, I think the kernel of my fascination with identity, specifically Irish identity, comes from that moment. My parents are very, very young. They go over to Birmingham because they didn't have jobs at home. And, my father worked as a Tetley tea man and my mother worked in a laundromat. And my older brother was born there. And a year later, I'm born there. And they realized very quickly that it wasn't a political thing. They realized very quickly that they were a young couple with two children and things would be easier back home in the community with my mother's sisters and all the other kids. So they just packed up everything and moved back home to Ireland 2 months after I was born. What's fascinating about that beginning is that I'm born in England. And going into the Troubles, which is this era which basically defines everybody as either one side or another, English or Irish, Catholic or Protestant. And I think that sort of kernel of where do I belong and where do I come from was planted in me at a very, very, right at the outset. What does identity mean? What does it mean to be born in England and raised in Ireland? So maybe there's something, a therapist could probably, a psychoanalyst could probably dismantle that better than I could, but there's something there. But it wasn't a political thing, but it was certainly the fact that I was born in 1968, right at the beginning of the Troubles, and had, my uncle, Paddy Joe McLean, was my mother's brother, was one of the hooded men. And for those who are listening to the podcast and don't know what the hooded men were, there were a handful of men who were lifted by the British and tortured. They were hooded and taken from their homes and tortured for being possibly in the IRA, suspected of being in the IRA. And they were tortured for information for a period of time. that case has continued to move through the European courts for the last 50 years. And my uncle suddenly passed away a year ago. He didn't get to see this fully resolved. But so the idea of coming back home, and this is my home and this is my identity, growing up in a community that was Catholic in Northern Ireland, and you take a look at what happened with the Troubles in historical terms. People think of Belfast or they think of Derry, but if you look at the facts and the figures, County Tyrone, specifically where I grew up, was the third place that lost the most amount of people. It was Belfast, Derry, and Tyrone were the hotspots. So it was, I grew up into it. That was my, existence.
Just to kind of pursue a little more, what I'm also curious about is with this explosion of violence. Mm-hmm. Your parents have already made the decision to immigrate once and go to Birmingham. Now facts on the ground have changed in Tyrone. Mm-hmm. It's no longer, I get the point that it is great to raise one's family surrounded by grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins. That's the optimal scenario. But in the face of this burgeoning violence, why not roll the immigrant dice a second time?
Why not? I don't think a lot of people had the means to do that at that time. My parents certainly wouldn't have had the means, I don't think, to sort of get on. You needed two things. One, you needed the means to sort of pick up your family and relocate to America, rent an apartment, get a job. But the other thing you needed was a community of people to sort of take you in when you got there, to sort of make sure that transition could happen. Coming over without friends or family is an enormous challenge, even today. So I don't think either of those things were in place, nor do I really believe they would have relocated anyway. I write about this in my memoir, That's That. When you grow up in a war, you don't think there's a war going on. It's like you just accept that this is my environment and it's normal and this is how everybody must be living. So it wasn't like I was walking around feeling like, oh my God, we're being evacuated from the store while we're out grocery shopping because there may be a bomb in here. There wasn't a feeling of fear. There was a feeling of amusement, like something was happening. I remember, even as a teenager, starting to drink and being in our local bar that had been bombed several times. And, suddenly the lights coming on and everybody drop your drinks and run for the door. There's a bomb. And literally standing there with my pint saying, I'm not leaving until I finish my pint. And that was the attitude. It wasn't until years later, after I got sober, that I fully was able to acknowledge and realize, oh my God, we grew up in a war. I lost people. People I knew were shot and killed.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you about, Colin. That's because I picked up that feeling of normality, because that's what you grew up in. I'm thinking of an English movie I saw about kids who grew up during the Blitz. And they were having the time of their lives, roaming around the ruins, coming across, artifacts from a downed German plane or something like that. There's another aspect that comes up with you in terms of the Troubles. That sort of feeling of being swept into something, kind of like a gravitational pull that you seem to find yourself in a few places of being pulled deeper and deeper into the story.
Without question, I feel like my own personal, what came first, the chicken or the egg? It's a sort of a tricky one. I realize probably as I've grown older that maybe I was always curious. Maybe I was a curious child. I was also very rebellious. Maybe that was just in my blood and my nature. I don't know. But the people that I started associating with, the situations that I got myself involved in were by any regards, very precarious. And, I was the kind of guy who could find trouble and find people who were in trouble. And there was always a sort of an excitement to that age. There was also an underlying rage that I had, because I could understand as a child that being Catholic in Northern Ireland, I was living as a second-hand citizen, and we were being oppressed. We were being treated differently than our Protestant neighbours. Simple example. You could not, as a Catholic, nor would you, call the police for anything at all. The police were Protestant, and they were for the Protestants, and they were our enemy. So we, as Catholics, lived in an environment that we policed ourselves, because we understood the establishment, the political establishment, the police force, all to be on the other side and working for the other side. And that is, simple, to boil it down, even simpler terms, to be going to mass on a Sunday morning and have a British checkpoint, stop a car, stop your father's car, and have them, some snotty-faced young British soldier at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning insulting your father and, being arrogant and abusive. And these were common. Having to see Catholic people take this abuse. And then as a teenager, I was driving when I was 16, starting to experience it myself. I remember being 16 and being stopped on the road at night and having a British soldier put a gun in my face and saying, "I'll blow your head off." Because I was Catholic, not because I did anything. And if you're alone, 16 years of age, at 1 o'clock in the morning on a dark country road with some guy with an accent with a gun a rifle pointed in your face saying, "Come on, push me, Paddy. Give me a reason to blow your head off." Those kinds of things, that's, to accept that as normal, which it was, is an insane thing. So this idea of, I guess, it's almost like I became like a pressure cooker. It just became more and more apparent that something was going to explode. And as someone, I guess, maybe, and this is the other side of it, who grew up very perceptive, it's obvious now that I was perceptive and had this sort of artist gene or writer's gene, whatever it is, that I was sort of taking in all this information but had no way of processing it or articulating it or nowhere to talk to about, sort of how I felt. It's a bizarre sort of cauldron to be in.
I'm thinking of your image there with the soldier with the gun in your face. He's probably about 2 years older than you were at the time, my guess. Somebody who knew about as much as you did about life. Also, from things I picked up, Colin, it sounds like this pressure cooker you felt yourself in, and that your mother recognized you were in this kind of pressure cooker, may have punched your ticket to New York.
In 1986, I had started living in London, squatting in North London. I had moved out of but I moved into a squats in North London with a bunch of Belfast, Derry, and Tyrone guys. And we were, by all accounts, a very crazy, dangerous sort of crew. I got to know a lot of guys at that point who were more involved than I was. And and I would spend a few months in London, I would go back to Northern Ireland. And during that time, while I was back in Tyrone, the Loughgall massacre happened. And 8 young Irish boys from our community were shot and killed by the British SAS while they were planning to attack a police station in the village of Loughgall. And I went to 3 wakes in one afternoon. Boys that I knew, boys that I drank with. And you go into the room and you see an open coffin with 2 IRA men at either end and the family in absolute bits. And these boys with their faces half blown off. And the IRA wanted open coffin caskets for these boys because they wanted the community to realize these are 18-year-old boys who could have been arrested if they had the information and knew that they were going to do it beforehand. Why didn't they arrest them? Why did they surround the place and wait for them to show up and then just have a turkey shoot and massacre these boys? They did it because Margaret Thatcher at the time had a shoot to kill policy in Northern Ireland. And basically, to boil it all down, what she had said was, I'm tired of taking these people in and trying them and then them getting back out in the street. You have my permission to just take them out. No trial, just shoot them. And that's what happened. That's the bottom line. And what happened in Loughgall, it happened in Gibraltar, it happened to my friend Brian Mullen 2 years later. And these boys were assassinated when they could have just as easily been arrested and tried.
So being exposed to that kind of violence and tragedy for the families in Northern Ireland, I imagine that it would have been awfully easy to get pulled in deeper and to become actively involved. And I wonder, is that one of the reasons that you didn't go back to London, but you opted to go to New York because, let's say the possible outcomes wouldn't have been particularly good. You talked a little bit about that move?
Sure. At that time, after Loughgall, it's a strange thing to talk about. I was working with Brian Mullen, and for those who are listening to the podcast, just go to YouTube and look up Brian Mullen. He was someone who was sought after by the British at the time. And I would go on these little expeditions with him where I would drive the car, and he was a brickie and I was his labourer, and we were very good friends. He was my neighbour. I knew him my whole life. And I would drive the car for him, drive it over the border. And we were actually lifted and interrogated by the British for hours. And I was only a young boy, but he was, it was very obvious being with Brian that Brian was a big fish. He was a big fish. And after Loughgall, my mother seen that Brian would come by and he'd pick me up. We'd go over the border. We'd go down the south. And I never knew what was happening or where Brian was going. I just did the driving, kept my mouth shut. Brian was my friend, and I cared about him deeply. And after Loughgall, when that happened, my mother basically took me aside one day and she said, I know what you're thinking of doing. I see what you're doing. I see where you're headed. I want you to understand that if you pick up that gun, you also put it in the hands of your 2 younger brothers who follow and imitate everything you do. So if you pick up the gun, you're picking it up for all 3 of you. And if something happens to one of them, it's on your soul. And that was powerful, powerful. That's when I decided to go to America, because I couldn't put the gun in my brother's hands. And that was a powerful, powerful thing for my mother to do at the time. Only a mother, I guess. And I came to America. True story. I was here 3 months in my apartment in Bainbridge Avenue, and my mother called me and she said, I have really bad news for you. And I said, what? And she said, Brian Mullen was assassinated by the SAS with his brother-in-law and his brother-in-law's brother. And all 3 of them were in the car that I drove for Brian. And that was 3 months after I left home. So I again, none of this really meant much other than I drank more at that time. it wasn't until much later I was able to start piecing and articulating and putting all the pieces together and realizing that, somehow and for some reason, I dodged a bullet.
So when we talk about your work, obviously we can't talk about it in any meaningful way without acknowledging, let's say, a significant substance abuse problem, whether that's alcohol or whether that's drugs, etc. And I think to some degree you must be laying the case that your origin story in Northern Ireland certainly aggravated that problem. But I also kind of wonder whether escaping from underneath that whole cloud of oppression and arriving in New York with its kind of the immigrant experience and a degree of anonymity that you wouldn't have in small town Tyrone, whether that also was a contributing factor. So how do those pieces actually fit together?
I can tell you that you give me a smile, because I smile every time I think of it, arriving on Bainbridge Avenue and seeing all the Irish bars, seeing the tricolours painted proudly on the side of all these Chevy vans, McCormick's painting and, Donnelly's floor service or whatever it was. And it was like somebody just lifted a huge burden off me, because I realized this is the first time that I'm able to be Irish openly without worrying about somebody shooting me. And that was an amazing feeling. And the freedom and the sort of like pride that went into being Irish and to announcing your Irishness. And then the fact that we were embraced to the degree we were by the the American community. Like being Irish at that time was like a get out of jail free card. It was like you had arrived in the land of freedom, which is what I felt for the first time. And yeah, I drank heavily. I had developed an alcohol problem long before I came to America, though. I was an alcoholic by the time I was drinking. 16, 17, I was already a guy who drank to get drunk. I was never a social drinker. I didn't know how to do that. I started drinking, and again, is it all connected? Absolutely. A guy called Gabor Mate, who's very, very great philosopher on addiction and alcoholism, says famously, I've never met an alcoholic or an addict who was not covering some pain or trauma, who wasn't trying to numb or self-medicate some trauma. And that was certainly my case. It was also compounded by this idea that I had no idea really who I was or where I fit into the world. So my identity, the only place I felt safe was in a bar with alcohol. And of course, that's a very dangerous place to find your identity.
Your description of alcoholism, really, really riveting, and as severe as just about any I've come across. I think calls to mind The Iceman Cometh, some of the characters in that, and also Brendan Behan. And I know he's included in your book. And just a little backstory people have heard before, but I was involved with the promotion of Brendan at the Chelsea when it came over from the Belfast Lyric Theatre. I don't know if you had a chance to see that.
I didn't, unfortunately.
And it opens with, Adrian
Dunbar.
Adrian Dunbar is Brendan Behan, and it opens with a scene of him waking up hungover, and it is like a contact hangover. Everybody in the theater could feel exactly what he was feeling. And in an earlier episode, we had Janet Behan, his niece, on, and she wrote the Brendan at the Chelsea, but sort of a diversion.
I just spent, just on that note, probably the last 7 months, I I'd been playing around with it before, but I spent seriously the last 6 or 7 months writing and finished a screenplay on Brendan Behan, a biopic.
Wow. Oh, so, fantastic!
It's certainly very fresh in my mind at the moment. Fascinated with Brendan's story. Such a beautiful, talented, dark and troubled genius. God bless him.
Who also loved New York.
Well, my entire script is focused on his American years. Mostly New York, yes.
He certainly was notorious. And I don't think I'm telling a story out of turn here, but there was a performance where the Irish American writers and artists came to Brendan at the Chelsea, and we had a talk back with the cast after the play. And Malachi McCourt said, raised his hand and said, I want to take issue with something about Brendan Behan's story. He said he was the first person to appear drunk on American TV. That was me. Anyways.
Amazing. Malachi's one of my favorite people in our community. Mm-hmm. He is a legend and an icon. And I don't think people realize what an important presence he is. And I love that guy. He's been so inspirational for me in my life. Also somebody who's been sober and openly sober for so many years. A huge inspiration for me also to keep going and, to just do and give back and try to tell the stories and be involved in the community. Yeah, I love him so much. He's such a great human being.
Talk to me about the other aspect of your origin story, your writer origin. It seems to me you arrive in New York, you work in kind of, the trades and the construction business, but you're also you're writing, but your first real success in terms of published work is your memoir, Orangutan, where you basically give probably the most unflinching portrait of, the Irish immigrant addict experience. I'm not sure if that's a fair description of the book, but, it certainly struck me that way. How did you balance out becoming a writer? Were you a writer, or wasn't it until you got sober that you could possibly be a writer?
I'd started writing probably, I'd been writing when I was a kid and had that idea. It wasn't until I was in London and I read a novel by Charles Bukowski called Post Office, that I thought, this guy's writing like I think I could write. And I started reading a lot more and realizing there's something here, like that's not some classic literature thing that's inaccessible to me, I could do that, I think. And so I did start toying around with writing in my early 20s. When I was 23, when I was 21, I moved to San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco for a year, and I got sober first in San Francisco. And I got my first typewriter in San Francisco and tried to start typing. I was 22 years old. And I still have the first page, actually, that I typed in that apartment in San Francisco. But then I quit drinking when I was 23, realizing that I was an alcoholic. And in my 20s, I went to college at Lehman. I put myself through Lehman College. And I went there because I'd started going to poetry readings. And I heard this in the Beale Bocht in Riverdale. And I heard this guy, Billy Collins, and he was teaching at Lehman. And I went to go there to work with Billy. And during the time I studied with Billy Collins became the poet laureate of the US. Now, meanwhile, he's my mentor at Lehman. And he and I developed a very rich friendship. I studied with Billy for 4 years. And then I opened up a used bookstore, coffee shop in Riverdale called the Guitar and Pen. And then when I was 31, just as I had my first play produced up in the Bronx and had my first short story published, I started drinking right there and then. And
so just to interrupt you.
Yes.
You're now getting traction, right? Now, all of a sudden, just on the verge of some kind of success, you start drinking again.
Yeah.
That's like, Freud would have a freaking field day with
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
Is it like a fear of any kind of success was at play?
Well, the number one factor was I wasn't really sober. I hadn't really done the work. A year after I was sober, I was in New York outside my local bar up in sober and got knocked down by a car and broke my back in 2 places, wound up in a body brace for a year and got addicted to pills, Vicodin, codeine, whatever I could get my hands on. And it was right at the beginning of that whole sort of pill thing. And I didn't realize how bad of an addict I was, but I was an addict full-blown addict for 6 years. So I wasn't drinking, but I was not sober. And so when I drank again, it was just the culmination of 6 years of not really being sober. I was sober enough that I was able to go to college. I was sober enough that I was able to buy a house in Riverdale. I had all the external things, but I was still a functioning addict. I had 3 doctors on the go. They would write me up prescriptions. They didn't know about each other. And I had 3 different pharmacies. That went on for 6 years. So when the success hit, I didn't feel like I deserved it. I didn't feel like I was ready. I wasn't ready emotionally. So I drank and I didn't write another word for 8 years. I drank for 8 friggin' years from 31 to 39. Unreal. And how I literally to this day, I don't know. There's definitely some divine power who has been looking out for me, who was insisting that I live to tell the stories. I do feel that way. And that somehow I was delivered at the other end of it, broken and bruised, but still standing, and was able to take another shot at actually getting sober and getting into therapy and doing the work and looking at the trauma. And that's when I started to write. 39, when they took me from my apartment in Hell's Kitchen up to the farmhouse upstate to dry out, I started writing like my life depended on it. And I started writing my story, which became Orangutan.
We're looking, actually for our listeners, we're both talking to Colin and we're watching him on Zoom. So we're able to see each other. We're seeing him up in his writing room. So it's kind of the culmination of this journey that he started that has led to so much creative output. But I'm going to ask you a question, Colin. Are you right-handed or left-handed?
Right-handed.
So on your right hand, when you look down with your pen in your hand, you're looking at a tattoo. Tattoo of barbed wire?
That's barbed wire, yes.
And a very significant early scene in A Bend in the River. John Duddy, the actor John Duddy, is grabbing onto some barbed wire, causing himself to bleed. And of course, you grew up in a world surrounded by barbed wire. Tell us a little. Let us use that as a way to get into the film.
What a beautiful thought. What a beautiful connection you just made. Yeah. And what's really funny at the beginning of A Bend in the River, which is a very autobiographical story for me, John Duddy, the writer, Matt Donnelly as a character, arrives home in County Tyrone to face the ghosts of his past. And he steps out of the car and he's holding the barbed wire. And in that scene, he's actually looking over the field at the house that I grew up in. And that is a bizarre, I've talked about this a little bit recently, where I made that movie not fully realizing what it was I was doing until I was in it. And then realize, what I've done is I've brought myself back home to confront the ghosts of my past and further put to bed some of the doubts and pains and maybe also ultimately to a place of forgiveness, and where I'm past the anger. I don't have the rage that I did, that drove me from home, that drove me to being an alcoholic. I'm past that. And really, I can see the story now from both sides and understand what a complicated situation Northern Ireland is. And, we live in a society that's so fixed on division and seeing things in either black or white. And life's not like that. Life is very, very nuanced. And every single problem is nuanced. And people are nuanced. And when you really explore and get past the judgment, we're all so alike. And, we're all sort of running from pain, and, people in general, whether they show it or not, are hurting. Life is difficult, and we really don't want people to hate us. And most people would much rather have a nice, comfortable, loving life. And that's sort of the movie, going through the process of making a bend in the river to the other side, sort of helped me express where I'm at now emotionally, I think, with Northern Ireland specifically, and my childhood and all those things, the troubles.
And John Duddy, who I'm lucky enough to know, terrific guy, amazing guy. His character there, your autobiographical character, he certainly was writing as if his life depended on it.
It's amazing. And John Duddy, I love John Duddy like a brother. He's someone I met just after he finished. He walked away from boxing. I was not a sports fan, although I had seen one of his last fights. And we just bumped into each other and started talking. And that's a conversation that's been going on for 10 years. And, he was in both of my plays. He was in Spud Munchers. He was in Father Who. He was one of the leads in Emerald City, and now is his first major leading role in A Bend in the River. And he's just one of these, his character, he's also someone who is able to go explore this with me because he's from Derry. He grew up there. So we were both on the sort of personal journey, and it became apparent that maybe this was why we had met, and that we sort of had to go do this thing together. And, you see in the movie, there's a flashback of the footage of the priest, the iconic footage that basically is the image that starts the Troubles, of the priest with the little white flag, and they're carrying the bloodied boy, and John Duddy's having this flashback to the Troubles. That boy is his uncle. That's Jackie Duddy, the first boy shot at the very beginning of the Troubles, shot and killed. Then John Duddy is named for his uncle, John Jackie Duddy, and becomes a fighter. And we didn't realize, I think, until we were in the process of making the movie, what it was we were doing. And we really had to just have a conversation about, like, if we're going to do this, let's do it. And let's be honest, and let's really explore what this is and get it out there. And it was as personal a journey for him as it was for me. And for a lot of other, like Shane Kelly, the cinematographer, who shot the Oscar-winning Boyhood and Scanner Darkly. And he walked off a $35 million movie that he just wrapped with Cate Blanchett to come shoot that movie, because he lives in my local village. Grew up 3 miles from me, and wanted to do this movie because he also wanted to go back and explore, what this meant to go back home to our community and sort of honor the place and sort of try and make sense of it in some cinematic way.
The photography in the movie was just fabulous, and it presents, a bucolic view of Tyrone that was a real pleasure to look at, especially with the recurring views of the wind moving through the forest. I loved all that. What surprised me, though, about the film was clearly the character of Matt Donnelly. returning from New York, trying to resolve his difficulties, trying to kind of stabilize himself. The real question, I guess, the mystery as you get drawn into the film is, what is his trauma? Why is he behaving like this? And of course, you're clicking through all the different Irish possibilities, right? Especially in Northern Ireland. Is it the Troubles? Or is it maybe clerical abuse? You know, we've got a fast driving priest in that. Is that presaging something? Or is it something more innocuous and surprising? Just the trauma of bad things happening in a classroom, more mundane. And that's what's, you know, I really enjoy that, because you didn't go with the obvious.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. You know, that was, I think that's sort of like was my realization also doing it, and, you know, going through so much therapy and digging into my past. It's not the big things. It's something maybe you have shelved that you're not giving the weight to, that you realize, wow, this thing really, really affected me. And I've been carrying this one thing my whole life. And I've created this monster out of what is practically a normal, everyday human being. And, you know, it's like opening up the closet door and confronting the monster and taking it out of the closet, and then sort of being able to say, that's, as an adult, I can understand what the situation is. As a child, I couldn't. The child looks up and sees the monster. The man can see the bigger picture and in the light of day. And that sort of was, it is a very subtle thing. And it's not about, it's about all of the things. Of course, it's about identity and the Troubles and the ghosts of the past and the mother and his guilt at leaving home and not being there and not fighting. And, you know, but it's like that, I guess the thing for me was, and it sort of wraps it up with the Seamus Heaney poem, you know, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun, I'll dig with it. And sort of coming to that realization that that's my role in the community, is to tell the stories. I was somehow given a gift to write and tell stories, and it is my duty to use it and tell the stories and explore these things, and maybe, you know, maybe that helps somebody else down the line, you know.
Is storytelling, so you kind of, you know, presaged my question. Is it something inherent in the Irish character? And what I want to also ask is writing is a very solitary thing. The output is a story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Making a movie, the output is a story, but the complexity is quantum, right? You're no longer locking yourself, you know, in your little crow's nest. You are dealing with, I need to find money. I need to find actors. I need to find a cinematographer. I need to get a script done.
Work and talk to people.
These are two totally different kind of things. How do you bridge that? How did you make that?
Well, that's an interesting conversation, and we could go on about that one all day, because getting sober, one of the things I realized about my alcoholism was that I actually suffered from severe social anxiety. And alcohol helped me feel comfortable when I was around other people. It helped me be able to talk or be a part of, even though I felt slightly different or alien. Alcohol helped ease that. And without alcohol, I became very, very socially anxious as a sober person. And it was very hard for me to get back into the world and be a part of the world without alcohol to, you know, lubricate my social existence. So getting into a situation where I was going out and I didn't realize I'd done it, making the first movie, Emerald City. The first day we went to go shoot, and I go there and there's like 15 people, and everybody's saying to me as the director, what are we doing and how we're all going to have to get lunch together and blah, blah, blah. And I was freaked out. I had like an anxiety attack. And I remember walking off. We were shooting up in Goshen, the first scene in the movie. And I walked off away from everybody. And I had a moment where I just thought, this is important. This is important that I sort of learn how to be part of this social sort of thing that has to happen to make a movie. And actually, the process of making movies has helped me a lot with being better socially and talking to other people and more people, sitting at a table of 10 people that you're working with and having a conversation absolutely terrified me before. And then you're in a social situation where literally you're the point of focus. It wasn't like I could hide all day for 12 hours. I was the focus. Hey, this is not working. How do we do this? Blah, 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 blah. And it's like right on me. And that was a healing process for me. It really helped me a lot to sort of get out of my own shell and become less fearful and get past the idea that people are so concerned about me. Because part of social anxiety is you think everybody's so focused on you and how you sound and how you look and your accent and what am I wearing and where's my hair and it's like horrible. And then to sort of get past it and realize, oh, everybody's in their own heads, right, dealing with their own fears and insecurities, and they're not that focused on me. Everybody's dealing with their own madness. And that's life. We all sort of are so separate from each other, and we're literally standing in front of each other. It's a weird thing, but it helped me sort of realize that, and that's helped me a lot with my social anxiety. I'm less fearful about, I feel the fear, but I'll do it anyway. And knowing that I'm okay, I'll be okay.
Well, Colin, you're dealing with the madness creatively on more channels than probably anybody we've ever talked to. And Martin and I always know we've had a good conversation when we feel it only started. But we are wrapping up, getting towards the end. And this is our chance to let you put out your advertisement to the world in our famed segment, the Shameless Plug.
The two things that I have happening right now, which I love people to know about, are obviously the movie. That's number one. My movie, A Bend in the River, is now available on Amazon Prime. It's on Google Play. It's on YouTube. You can rent or buy it. Just put it into whatever server you have that you watch movies on. If it's YouTube on your phone, you can even do it. And you can rent the movie, I think, for $2.99 or $3.99, or you could buy it for $10. And, if you do watch it, leave us a rating or a review or reach out and tell other people, help us spread the word. It is a new movie that's just out there, and we just want people to see it and enjoy it and talk about it, and hopefully. And the other thing is I just re-released my book, The Writing Irish of New York, which is two things. One, it's a history of all Irish writing in New York and America. It's got Brendan Behan and J.P. Dunleavy and stories about Maeve Brennan, but it's also got 20 very, very personal essays by some of the top Irish and Irish-American authors of today: Colin McCann, Peter Quinn, Malachy McCourt, Larry Kerwin, Luann Rice. People, it's just fascinating because they wrote these wonderful personal essays about what it was to be an Irish person becoming a writer in New York, and the fears and anxieties around that, and how it was to live in New York trying to do that. And that just is released. It's on Amazon. You could buy it or get it on Kindle or whatever. And again, that's called The Writing Irish of New York. And anybody who has questions outside of that, please look me up on my website, www.colinbroderick.com. And thank you.
We'll leave all these links in our show notes, and we'll promote on social media. Happy to be a small part of spreading the word. We look forward to your book about Brendan Behan.
Screenplay, yeah, a movie.
Screenplay, great, even better. Yeah. Martin, any closing thoughts?
No, I just would like to say thank you. Thank you for being so brutally honest. It takes a lot of courage to be brutally honest, but I think it's also liberating. And I think the output that you have generated in the last 10 years is a reflection of that liberation. You know, you've been freed, you've got the monkey off your back, it seems. We all have monkeys on our back. They crawl on periodically and, we're never entirely free. But it is an inspiring story. And I'm amazed at how healthy you look, despite all the 20 years out of abuse of hard living in America. It's just amazing. So maybe indeed, as a God-fearing atheist, maybe you have convinced me on some level that there is some kind of, divine being that's looking down on top of you and kind of keeping you ticking along because, I'm just really looking forward to what's next.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So on behalf of my listeners, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know John and I really enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully we get to do it again.
In person would be good too.
That would be nice. I really enjoyed this, and thank you both, Martin and John. This was an absolute pleasure.
Colin Broderick, wow, amazing stories and such honesty as you touched on, Martin, with the way he delivered these tales of his life. I'm amazed by the artistic output of Colin, considering how many years of his life he lost. And to trace back to those lost years, look for why it all happened and get an image of the pressure cooker he was growing up under in the Troubles.
Yeah, there's kind of an unflinching honesty that Colin brings to telling his story. And to some degree, I had the sense that it was almost therapeutic to him, because if you're not honest with yourself, I don't think you can be a great artist. And one of the words that jumps to mind following that conversation was the sheer artistic intensity that Colin brings, whether that's writing or whether that's directing. He is a driven storyteller and feels an obligation to his Irish roots in telling those stories that make a difference. Really impressive stuff.
And that Irish identity that didn't emerge for him until he came to America. We've heard that story before. He saw himself more as a Catholic than Irish when he was living in County Tyrone. Kind of like Jack Byrne, our mystery writer from Liverpool, who identified with a Catholic upbringing more than an Irish upbringing. A lot of riveting stuff here, tremendous output. And of course, we want to leave everybody with the thought of see a bend in the river. Well worth your time.
Yep. A really beautiful film. So with that, I'd just like to wrap up and ask our listeners to support our podcast. We've been doing this for a year now. We're on about episode 27 or 28. And if you like what we're doing, what would be really helpful to us is for you to leave a review saying why you like the podcast. Hopefully you do like the podcast. But if you can leave a review on your platform of choice, that'll really help our podcast move along, because guess what? People actually read those reviews. They're the best kind of advertising. So if you think we're doing good work, leave us a review. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.